Test. Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today, either in person or on Zoom. I'd move to all of those who are celebrating. My name is Eric, and I'm a graduate student here at USD. I am getting my master's in Peace and Justice over at the Crop School. I am the founder of the student organization Palestine Solidarity Committee at USD. And throughout this year, we've been doing some educational programming and concluding with this event here this year. Before we get started and I introduce our panelists for tonight, I would just like to make a few acknowledgements. I would like to thank and highlight our sponsor, the Islamic Center of San Diego, and Imam Taha for making all of this possible. Hopefully they'll be joining us here shortly. We're gathered here for this event at a time of critical importance, and I'm very excited to dive into conversation with our two very distinguished guests. However, before I do that, I would just like to make some, state our community ground rules before we get started. So our conversation tonight might be sensitive for some and can be very politically charged as well for others. And I want to ensure that we maintain an atmosphere of integrity and respect throughout the night. And I want us to have the understanding that everyone in this room comes with the best intentions and the desire to learn and engage with each other in good faith. I want to ensure that our guests feel welcomed and respected. So with that being said, there won't be any tolerance for interrupting or any accusations of bad faith and bad intent. So as I've said, we're here at a time of critical importance for the struggle for Palestinian freedom. Last year, 231 Palestinians were killed, marking it as one of the deadliest years on record since the UN began recording in 2005. So far this year, 2023, there has been at least 98 Palestinians killed. Throughout the last few years, there has been a record amount of house demolitions, administrative detentions, separate violence, and the continuation of violence against Muslim and Christian worshippers that has now become tradition during the time of Ramadan and Easter. In less than a month, we'll mark the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And the Nakba is the name given to the systematic forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of over 750,000 Palestinians of their native indigenous homeland. However, Palestinians understand the Nakba as not just a one-time historical event, but as something that is ongoing and continuous to this day. The ongoing Nakba is seen in many instances throughout the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, such as the continued colonization of land and house demolitions in places such as Masr Yafa, where over 1,000 Palestinians are under the perpetual threat of having their lands stolen and their houses demolished. It's also seen in the establishment and expansion of settlements. It's seen in the house demolitions of Palestinians in places such as Tolwan and Shakir. It's seen in the apartheid practices such as control over movement of resources such as water. And it's seen in the various acts against international law and against human rights. Now is the most important time as ever to learn and engage with what is happening. It's mobilized, and being here is speaking to that. So thank you once again for your attendance. With that, all of that out of the way, I am thrilled to introduce our two panelists for tonight, Omar Shakir and Lynk. Omar serves as the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. As a result of his advocacy, the Israeli government deported Omar in November 2019. Prior to his current role, he was a Bertha Fellow at the Center of Constitutional Rights, where he focused on U.S. counterterrorism policies, including legal representation of Guantanamo detainees. As the 2013 to 2014 Arthur R. and Barbara T. Finberg Fellow at Human Rights Watch, he investigated human rights violations in Egypt, including the Rabaa massacre, one of the largest killings of protesters in a single day. A former Fulbright scholar in Syria, Omar holds a JD from Stanford Law, where he co-authored a report on the civilian consequences of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan as part of the international human rights in conflict resolution clinic. He had a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs and a bachelor's in international relations from Stanford. Moving on to Michael. Michael Lynk taught at the Faculty of Law at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, between 1999 and his retirement in 2022. He taught courses in labor, human rights, disability, constitutional, and administrative law, and has also served as Dean of Faculty between 2008 and 2011. Professor Lynk served as a labor arbitrator and mediator, and is presently an arbitrator with the Ontario Grievance Settlement Board. In May 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council unanimously selected Professor Lynk for a 6-year term as the 7th Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the Palestinian territory since 1967. In his capacity, he delivered regular reports to the UN General Assembly in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva on human rights trends in the OPT. He completed his term in April 2022. He has also written about his experience in a 2022 book, this one right here, which is also available to purchase after the panel over there. He co-authored this book with Richard Falk and John Dewar, two of his predecessors of the UN Special Rapporteur positions. This book is titled Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations. Please join me in welcoming our two panelists tonight. So before we get started into these questions, I kind of want to give you guys each a couple minutes to just share, your personal experiences in this field, kind of why you've been drawn to Palestine specifically, and any background you might give here.
Sure, let me start. And thank you for that. The book, by the way, if I can do a little plug for it, all the royalties for the book are going to Playgrounds for Palestine. And so I urge you to at least consider taking a copy home. In terms of my own background, I'm old enough, as you can probably tell, that I was weaned on anti-apartheid work as a student and as a law student in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I cut my teeth there. How I became interested in Palestine, interesting enough, I'd gone to late 1970s, I'd gone to McGill University for graduate work in political science and got involved in anti-apartheid activities there, and met a number of activists who had come up from New England, New Jersey, New York, to take advantage of a great university with much cheaper tuition than it was in the United States. Many of them were American Jews, and many of them were activists on the question of Palestine. That was my introduction. So it was a twofold introduction. First, I began to learn about the question itself. But secondly, the fact that young American Jews were advocating for Palestinian rights made me realize that this wasn't an issue that was wrapped up in religious differences, although it had those features. It wasn't an issue that was primarily focused on ethnic struggle, though it has those features. It really was an issue involving rights. And I think from there, that was the wellspring for how I got involved in that. I skipped my my law school graduation and went to Palestine for 5 or 6 weeks. One of my friends from Montreal, a young American Jew from Massachusetts, was editing an English language Palestinian newspaper out of. And through her, I met a wide range of both Palestinians and Israelis who were working on issues involving the occupation. Obviously, 1981, going there was a much different time than it is now. But once you're there, and I'm sure many of you in the audience have been there, it became ingrained in your blood, something you'd want to really get rid of. And although I went on to become a labor lawyer, both in private practice and also working for trade unions, and then became a labor academic and a labor arbitrator, I kept up with my interest in the issue. I went in 1996 to the Canadian government to invigilate the Palestinian elections. I went there on several other occasions, mostly through academic exchanges. And while my main writings were in areas of domestic Canadian labor law, I also began to write on Palestine as well. And I think it was probably because of my academic track record on Palestine, plus the fact that I worked in 1989 for UNRWA during the first Palestinian Intifada, and that was probably the door that opened up becoming special rapporteur, why the UN decided to appoint me.
Thanks so much. And let me just start by echoing my thanks to Eric in particular, who's put in many hours on planning this event. It's really an honor to have the chance, and also an honor to be well deserved, and really an honor to be next to Professor Lynk. We've done dozens of events and meetings online, but it's actually the first event we do in person. So it's really a treat. And I learned a lot just already from your first answer. So I'm looking forward to the rest. So, my journey, I'm Iraqi American, so I was born and raised in California, just up north a little bit. And so I went to college, and time for Iraq War, second Intifada. And very much for me, college was a place, I was a student organizer there on a range of issues. And I very much discovered that I wanted to commit my life to working on human rights issues, a universal vision, but very much at the time being an American, but also being somebody originally from Iraq, very much tied to the Middle East, but also the post 9/11 moment in the United States. So I sort of knew in college that I wanted to work on these issues. Israel-Palestine was one of the issues. I went for the first time in 2005 as a student, but it was a much broader set of interest. I actually did my undergraduate thesis on the Egyptian opposition movement. And so I graduated, and I had the chance to go to Syria for a year, which was really, kind of live there and experience situations before the more recent events in Syria, 2007, 2008. And then I did a master's in Middle East studies. Between those two things, I sort of knew that I wanted to use a set of legal tools to work on these issues. So I went to law school. I dabbled in different types of work, including working for a tribunal in The Hague, working for the ACLU. I did an internship. I did a clinical experience that was mentioned in my introduction, working on U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan. So I graduated law school knowing that I wanted to work either in human rights advocacy, documentation, or possibly litigation. So out of law school, I immediately got a position with Human Rights Watch, and I went from taking the bar exam. While I was studying for the bar exam, there was a military coup in Egypt, and the Egyptian government started the mass killings of protesters. And I showed up fresh out of passing the bar exam, and I was on the ground in Cairo, and suddenly I was the Human Rights Watch's only person on the ground documenting a massive human rights crisis, including a massacre on the scale of Tiananmen that I ended up writing a report about. I then went for a couple of years and did litigation around Guantanamo, mostly, but I also touched on Israel-Palestine with my work on the Center for Constitutional Rights. I was one of the lawyers that represented Professor Steven Salaita, who some of you might know was fired from a tenured faculty position in Illinois over tweets about Gaza. And I was offered a job to come back to Human Rights Watch to cover Israel-Palestine. And I've been doing that for 6.5 years. Split about half that time on the ground until the Israeli government deported me. And I've been working with my team on the ground, but outside Israel-Palestine for the last 3 years.
Thank you both very much. Omar, I'm going to start out with you. In the introduction, I mentioned the Human Rights Watch report from 2021. It's about 2 years old now, to the month almost.
Yeah.
Amnesty International has come out with a report. Over 25 Israeli organizations have come out with similar reports. And maybe most importantly, many civil society organizations in Palestine have been saying this for years and even decades, naming the oppression in Palestine as apartheid. So can you talk about how you see the impact of apartheid practices on the human rights and the well-being of Palestinians living in the occupied territories and within Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. Hard to do, in a concise way. It's a big question, right? But I think that the underlying thing that you need to know is that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is one government that effectively controls this area. And there are two groups of people of roughly equal size that live in this area, right? Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. And you have a government whose policy is methodically to privilege one group of people, Jewish Israelis, and to systematically repress the other, Palestinians, at different degrees of intensity, right? So that understanding, as simple as it may sound, sort of flies in the face of how Israel-Palestine is probably discussed in many places, including, in California, including in San Diego, including at this university. So Palestinian life is fundamentally shaped and altered. Their realization of basic rights is undermined based on who they are. Now, this takes very different forms in the different areas, under Israel's control, right? It looks different, for example, in Gaza, where not only has the population been under a more than half-century-long occupation, not only do they weather regular cases of the Israeli government bombarding them, resulting in killings of scores, or in some cases hundreds of civilians and children, but for 16 years, Gaza has been treated effectively as an open-air prison. The Israeli government has imposed a closure policy, nobody in, nobody out, unless you fall within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions. There are restrictions also on the entry and exit of goods. So you have a situation where 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid, where the majority of families spend the majority of their days without electricity. Shift to the West Bank, you have military occupation, which is rooted in the application of dual bodies of law, right? So if you're a Palestinian, you live under draconian military law. So not only are you facing, regular raids and killings and arrests, which we can talk a lot more about, but you're also living in a system where if you and a Jewish Israeli who lives in a settlement across the street, settlements are unlawful, they're a violation of the Geneva Convention, they're a war crime, you're tried in different courts where you have different rights and you receive different sentences for the same offense. Not only that, but you have discriminatory acts, like less access to resources, land than the Jewish Israeli settlers. Shift to East Jerusalem, occupied territory, international law, but which Israel has annexed. Many of those same dynamics are there, including on legal status. So if you are a Palestinian Jerusalemite that comes to study at the University of San Diego, and you're a Jewish Israeli who comes to study at the same university, you live here for several years, you move back to Jerusalem, this Palestinian who is stateless may have their residency right revoked by having been away for too long. Whereas the Jewish Israeli who's a citizen can return, can live there. And even if you're a Palestinian who lives inside Israel proper, right, where you're formally a citizen, you still have an inferior legal status by law. You remember, for a different nationality, your rights are restricted, including your access to land, you attend separate schools, etc. And that's all not even to mention that more than half the Palestinian population are living outside, the majority of them as refugees. Nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees who, Eric, you mentioned at the beginning that Professor Lynk, you mentioned that many people in this room have maybe been to Israel, Palestine, but these refugees, some of whom, have keys to the home that they're from, have lived there for generations, are denied their ability to return to the country they're from solely because of who they are. So that's a short answer, I guess.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up to that. Can you talk about some of the challenges that Human Rights Watch has faced since releasing this report, and kind of the experience in navigating those challenges? In your bio, you mentioned how you were deported in 2019. I'm correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I'll say a little bit about the challenges Human Rights Watch has faced. You can also hear from Professor Lynk, who was blocked for the entirety of his tenure from actually going to the place that he works on. I mean, that gets completely swept under the rug, but imagine a UN appointed expert on a territory that's blocked in effect by the host government from the government that controls the area. The host government, actually, the state of Palestine. Welcome, Professor Lynk, but it's the Israeli occupation. So for Human Rights Watch, we've faced restrictions for many years. It culminated in the Israeli government's decision to deport me in late 2019. So everybody knows the context. Their arguments evolved. They tried to block Human Rights Watch in 2017. At the time, they blocked the entire organization from hiring a foreign employee on the grounds that we were not a real human rights organization, but rather propagandist, between quotes, for Palestinians. That was immediately ridiculed by global media, pressure from states. We were eventually given a work permit. I got a work visa under the permit, but a day after I arrived, there was pressure. It ultimately culminated in the government revoking my work permit and ordering me to leave the country within 14 days claiming that Human Rights Watch supports boycotts of Israel, ignoring the fact that actually Human Rights Watch takes no position on boycotts. It's a legitimate tool. We respect the right to boycott, but we do human rights work. We document abuses. We call on people to respect human rights. We don't make calls that are to consumers. It doesn't matter. We challenged the decision. The court issued an injunction. I was allowed to remain for another year and a half when we fought the issue in the Israeli court system. We went up to the Israeli High Court, which upheld unanimously my deportation. I was forced to leave. So obviously that's the biggest impediment we face. We have staff on the ground. My colleague in Gaza has a very difficult time ever leaving the 25/7 mile Gaza Strip. She never left until she was 31. We can't get her out. We have to get help from others to get her permits to leave for trainings, for etc. We have trouble getting staff into Gaza. But I just want to lastly sort of note that what we face is not some anomaly. Right, the Israeli government has been methodically and systematically muzzling human rights organizations. My colleague at Amnesty, former colleague at Amnesty International, Lynk is a Palestinian. He was blocked by the Israeli government from leaving the occupied West Bank. His mother had cancer at a hospital 3 kilometers from his house, but beyond the checkpoint. He was denied the ability to be by her bedside while she had cancer. She died. We got him by side. Palestinian human rights organizations face the worst of it, including our partner organization, the oldest human rights organization in the Arab world, been around for more than 40 years. They were in 2021 declared outlawed by the Israeli government, declared a terrorist organization, an unlawful association. Their offices were raided, they were ordered closed, and they continue to operate bravely, but they face them. I was just with colleagues in Al-Haq earlier this week in the Netherlands. They face the prospect any single day of their staff being arrested, their bank accounts frozen, etc. So what we have faced, I think, speaks to a trend that most dramatically affects Palestinians.
And Michael, if you want to state any of the challenges that you've occurred in your position.
As Omar has mentioned, as special rapporteur, I wasn't allowed into the occupied Palestinian territory during my time as special rapporteur. This had begun with one of my predecessors, Richard Falk, who was appointed in 2008 by the UN Human Rights Council. He actually had organized a trip. He went with UN staff, landed at Ben Gurion Airport, and then was put into a airport detention center at the age probably of 74, 75, and held overnight and then put on the next plane back to Europe. Within a minute since, his successor, an Indonesian diplomat, was appointed, and he said at the time he was being asked to take the position, he said, "I'll take it, but only on the condition that Israel allows me to enter." And he served for about a year and a half, a year and 2/3, and then finally resigned when Israel had continued to refuse entry to him, even though he had a fairly good working relationship with the Israeli ambassador to the UN in Geneva. So then I'm appointed, and it was made clear that I wasn't going to get in either. They never said no, but what they did was just never answer any of my requests to be able to enter. So I would wind up going to Amman, Jordan, to meet UN officials from Palestine who would come across the river, Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations, and Palestinian ministers would come across and meet me there as well. And it's only gotten worse with respect to the UN. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights operates a fairly well-staffed office in Ramallah, Jerusalem, Gaza, and I believe in Hebron, if I'm not mistaken, is where the 4 offices are. And beginning about 2 years ago, there probably were about a dozen of the UN officials working for the Office of High Commissioner in Palestine who were internationals, and they began to not have their visas renewed. So one by one, when their visas expired, they would be going back generally to their home country to continue to work from abroad and trying to run the office. And they're now all gone. The last word I had is that none of them none of their successors have been allowed to come back in. And frankly speaking, the UN, I don't think raises a big enough fuss or stink with respect to this. And then a lot of it comes to, which I assume will be questioned later on, about the particular relationship that Israel has with the United States. And this very odd triangular relationship between Israel, the United States, and the United Nations. So the work winds up being diminished. What I can say though, I think that Israel and Palestine are far from being the best reported situation in the modern world, but it is, I think, one of the very best documented human rights situations in the modern world. So if I have a plan B, I had a plan B, a special rapporteur, it was that I had these excellent reports coming from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and B'Tselem and Al-Haq and a host of other local and regional organizations to be able to build my work on. The documentation is plentiful. I had no trouble at all writing any of the 12 themed reports that I delivered during the 6 years that I was special rapporteur, and finding a big depth of research and a depth of analysis and knowledge with respect to this. The question then becomes, who's reading it? Certainly diplomats in the global south, whenever I would meet them particularly in New York or Geneva, were well aware of what I was writing and had followed it and wanted to take action on it. It was very hard to attract attention, aside from a few exceptional countries in the global north. I mean, the countries I think where I had good relationship with and with their diplomats would be countries like Norway, countries like Ireland, countries like Belgium. But for the most part, there was indifference, if not hostility, to the human rights reporting on Israel and Palestine, and certainly at the very most indifference to what I was writing as well. Notwithstanding that, this is all happening, I guess, with these diplomats' eyes wide shut to what is going on.
Now, Michael, based on your observations and experiences as in your role as UN Special Rapporteur, can you talk about how this current situation in the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, how those compare to other instances of apartheid and other human rights violations around the world?
It's an interesting question because to some degree, apartheid is an historical question. We can probably point to several situations where there's been prolonged and probably illegal occupations, which I haven't tested them yet, but may amount to issues of apartheid. And the one that comes to my mind most readily would be Western Sahara. But there may well be other situations like that as well that would actually meet the test. Omar may have better understanding of it than I do. But we've got to remember this, and Omar's touched upon this, but let me emphasize, when human rights observers and advocates talk about apartheid today, and it certainly runs through all of these reports we've been talking about that have been issued over the last 3 years, we're not saying Israel is more or less like South Africa. That's not our comparison point, even though there are some similarities with respect to this. We're using the modern legal definitions that are found most astutely in the 1973 Convention on the Suppression of Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. Both of them contained definitions of apartheid. They differ in some secondary or tertiary aspects of it, but by and large, there's a common definition that you can extract from the two of them. And this is what Amnesty did. This is what Human Rights Watch did. This is certainly what I did in my 12th and final report with respect to this. As I was going through yesterday, actually, before I left on the plane to come here in my home in London, Ontario, I was going through some of the documentation I had on apartheid, and I was noticing I have a fairly thick subsection of reports or journalism, primarily by Israeli analysts or journalists, who are saying this is not apartheid. And by and large, what they were using, I think, in a very unsophisticated way, was this is not South Africa. We don't have benches here which say white and non-white, or Jew and non-Jew. We don't have separate drinking fountains. We don't have separate entrances, separate elevators. That's petite apartheid. Yeah, there are some ways that apartheid in South Africa was probably worse, or it was certainly different than the apartheid that exists in Israel and certainly in the occupied Palestinian territories. But there are many ways, and certainly this is one of the arguments of one of my distinguished predecessors, John Dugard, who was a renowned human rights lawyer and an advocate in South Africa from the 50s until the 90s. And my predecessor as a special rapporteur, who said, in many ways, apartheid in Israel and particularly in the occupied Palestinian territory is worse than was from all of his memory, all of his work in South Africa. But what we're looking at is the legal definition. Is there a situation of systemic discrimination, subjugation of one people over another with the intent to subjugate that people, and which results or has as an integral part of it inhuman or inhumane acts that are attached to that? So if you take each of those three aspects, is there a system of discrimination, amounts to subjugation of one racial group over another? I mean, I can cite many examples, but I think that the clearest example, it exists in the West Bank, where you have two different peoples distinguished by citizenship and ethnicity, who live in the same geographic and political space, yet enjoy two different, entirely different systems of legal, social, and political rights. Israeli Jews live in segregated, well-financed settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank that enjoy a European level standard of living, have full rights, as Omar had said earlier on, with respect to legal protections, with respect to being able to vote, with respect to all of the kinds of social benefits that come with living in an advanced social system. And kilometers away from them are over 3 million Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, enjoying slightly different levels of rights, but between them, but who have none of the rights, not even approaching what these Jewish settlers wind up having. Keep this in mind. You know, the most well-off Palestinian village or town or city in the West Bank still has vastly fewer rights than the poorest of the Jewish settlements that's in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. When you come to intent, there are literally hundreds of commentaries by past and present Israeli leaders who talk about no Palestinian state, that all the settlements are going to remain, and that we will control security between the river and the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. There is no, they don't have any plan A for what they do with the Palestinians, aside from them living in this realm of being rightless and stateless. And when it comes to the range of inhumane acts, you can go from issues of collective punishment to issues of restrictions on freedom of movement and freedom of assembly to abhorrent labor conditions. One, I'm particularly interested in my own background as a labor lawyer. Through all of these, and these have been well documented, particularly by the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty reports in considerable depth. And those wind up meeting the legal definition, the accepted international legal definition of apartheid. So that's the basis for how this comes. And if I can just add one small story to this. When I became special rapporteur in the spring of 2016, and I began to consider what I was going to be doing over the next 6 years, I said to myself, I'm never going to talk about apartheid. It's going to turn people off. It's going to shut down diplomatic and political decision makers from ever wanting to meet me. It's a word I don't need to use because the law is already so rich in international human rights law, international humanitarian law. All I have to do is write about how this law winds up applying to the occupation, how Israel is in violation of all this, and I'll use that to persuade these diplomats. I'll use that to persuade these political decision makers from the global north, and then things will change. By the fall of 2021, as I was approaching the end of my term, I had one more report to write. I realized it was impossible to want to avoid the question of writing about apartheid. Not only was the reality on the ground, even the European Union was using the term a one-state reality of unequal rights. When I put that into Google Translate, it comes out as apartheid. So it was clear to me that this had to be said. I wasn't the first person, even within the UN, to be able to say this, but I wanted to write a document, a report that would lay this out and be the basis for ongoing discussions within the United Nations on what's actually happening. And when I gave my last report in March of 2022 to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, I started off by saying, if the international community, and here I'm talking primarily about the global north, if the international community had adopted and followed its own resolutions from the Security Council and the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council 35 and 45 years ago, with respect to this occupation that was not going to go away, I would not be up here today talking about apartheid. But because of the extraordinary paralysis of the global north with respect to dealing with this, here we are with an entrenched occupation that has become permanent on the ground. It's an occupation that has drifted into annexation, that's now drifted into apartheid. Here we are with this. Albert Camus once wrote that calling a calamity by its wrong name only increases the afflictions borne upon the vulnerable in the world. You have to call it what it is. And I think now there's been we've almost said there's a unanimous verdict among the human rights community as to what is going on there.
You know, I think that last point you brought up is especially important as we see this continued violence happening, as we see the violence occurring as tradition after Ramadan. The importance of language and how we diagnose things, you know, similar to a doctor. To solve a problem, you first have to understand it and you have to properly diagnose it, you know, as a doctor would. And it sounds like, you know, apartheid is the best diagnosis that we have. And, you know, I understand that a lot of researchers, a lot of historians, you know, they would even say that it is worse than apartheid in some instances and such like that. But considering this continued violence, considering, you know, a lot of people believe that with this ongoing violence that a third intifada might be brewing, and other people believe that Israel is doing these actions intentionally to give pretext and justification for the perpetual oppression of Palestinians. Can you talk about how media reports really get it wrong in that diagnosis with the use of passive voice, with the use of improper language, and how that could even perpetuate the human rights abuses that are ongoing? The questions for either of you.
Sure. So thank you, Eric. And I think Professor Lynk laid out really well the law that is the basis for defining apartheid and the ways in which it applies to the situation on the ground. I would just note, just on the question before, Human Rights Watch has found apartheid in somewhere else in the world. That's with respect to the treatment of the Rohingya in the Rakhine state of Myanmar. You can find a report on that online. We also found crimes against humanity, including persecution, one of the two crimes we found here. And I'll just note parenthetically that persecution is very similar. You know, there are differences also, but it's defined relatively similar. It's also customary international law, also in the Rome Statute. It's basically, and you heard Professor Lynk lay out the three elements of apartheid. Again, we're sort of summarizing for a non-legal audience, but basically inhumane acts that take place in the context of systematic oppression by one group over another, and where there's an intent to maintain that regime or system. Those three elements. Persecution has very similar elements. Severe abuses of fundamental rights when they're done with a discriminatory intent, right? And this is persecution based on race and ethnicity. We also found persecution, again, same levels of apartheid. Not one is not worse. They're one of 11 crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute. Same gravity in the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. So we found we use the same legal tools everywhere, right? We document the facts, we apply the law, we issue our conclusions. That was the basis for our work in this particular context. But I mean, to your question, I think you're hitting at, I think, a critical issue. And I agree with the way you described the issue of, you know, diagnosis and the critical value of it. I mean, part of the impetus for writing the apartheid report, and again, I'll follow Professor Lynk by giving you a story. I remember being in a European capital in 2019 or early 2019. And I was trying to actually push this European country to take a stronger stand with regards to arbitrary arrest and torture by the Palestinian Authority. Right? I'm not even talking about Israel, I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority. And I'd written a huge report documenting systematic arbitrary arrest and torture of critics and opponents. And we found like possible crimes against humanity. We called for the very same types of, language about accountability, et cetera, in this context. So I'm sitting with this European foreign ministry. I'm trying to issue a public statement about these issues, cut funding to abusive security forces. And they came back to me and said, Omar, we need the Palestinian Authority for the peace process. So we can't do those. So we're sorry. And it was this moment, I remember staring at the ceiling of this meeting thinking, everything is backwards, right? That like, we suddenly have to overlook reality and facts in the name of preserving a non-existent process. That's not about peace. That's about maintaining the opposite of peace, right? I mean, 30 plus years of a peace process, right? I mean, the peace process has gone on more than half the life of the occupation itself, right? I mean, at some point you have to sort of step back and take stock of that reality. So, what the media coverage misses, right, often, and this is not unique to Israel-Palestine. There are some aspects that are unique to Israel-Palestine, but the situation here is that often what drives news coverage is the immediate spark or impetus, right? And there's obviously dynamics that often leads that stories that might involve Palestinian violence are newsy because the everyday structural violence and repression Palestinians face isn't newsworthy in the minds of many editors. Why is that? Well, because Palestinians for 56 years have on an everyday basis had their homes demolished, have been killed, have been denied their freedom of movement, have had their land expropriated, had new settlements built, have been imprisoned without trial or charge. So it's not a story for most editors sitting in London, New York, or Berlin for a story to come about yet another home demolition or killing, right? So what media coverage misses is fundamentally the nature of the structure. And that's also why we wrote the Apartheid report, right? It was to try to underscore what the underlying structural reality Palestinians face and to convey some basic facts, right? A 56-year occupation is not temporary, right? A 30-year peace process that at best is moribund, and that's being generous, is not going to dismantle systematic structural repression, right? An everyday reality of structural violence is not a conflict between two equal parties. A system methodically designed to privilege one people at the expense of another is not a conflict between equals. My good friend, Hagai Elad, the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, has written that democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. So, I'm saying all this to make the point about media coverage that we felt, and again, I'm going to be, honest, and I speak for human rights organizations when I say that for many years, you guys are probably mostly students or academics. The nature of our research is we want to be specific. Let's look at freedom of movement in Gaza, a small area. Let's look at the land access in Israel proper. But in the course of doing that specific research, we felt that we had failed to convey the underlying reality on the ground. So the research question I asked when I embarked on the project that led to the Apartheid report was a different research question. It was, how does Israel treat Palestinians? That question may seem elementary, but human rights researchers, like many of us, we tend to focus on specifics. To take that step back, and the scope of our inquiry was vital. And in so doing, human rights organizations have closed the gap between our reporting and reality. Media coverage in general is, I think, actually closing the gap in some ways. It's not fast enough, it's not good enough, it's not happening in maybe the forms of media that most people consume, let's say TV journalism in the US, for example, but it's happening in print, it's happening in social media, it's happening in many other parts of the world. Human Rights Watch's report on Israel-Palestine was the most covered report in the history of Human Rights Watch, and we cover 100 countries around the world. So, and it was covered in a way that I think largely was relatively fair. And it wasn't just the coverage of our report. Amnesty's report was covered, Professor Lynk's report was covered, the Israeli Human Rights Group was covered. Again, maybe it should have been more. And I've also seen some reporters, when they talk about events on the ground, reference the reporting around destruction. It's not enough. A lot more needs to happen. We need better journalists. Hopefully there's a journalism school here that you guys are all a part of and studying in, but some of these dynamics are shifting, not fast enough. The paradigm is shifting, as Professor Lynk said, and I'll repeat this again. There is a consensus today in the human rights movement on Israel's apartheid, right? It spans Israeli human rights groups. Eric mentioned 27 Israeli human rights organizations that used the word apartheid when the new government came to power. It's much beyond that. We have governments. We have South Africa, Namibia, the entire African bloc to the Human Rights Council, the same session that Professor Lynk released his report, the entire OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, the Arab bloc. We have former Israeli officials, attorney generals, deputy attorney generals, the former Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. I could go on for probably 25 minutes listing all the people who've called it apartheid. There is a consensus. Everyone who's looked at it has reached this conclusion, but that consensus has not yet penetrated the corridors of power in the global north, right? That's using Professor Lynk's terminology. And two, it's not yet changed the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground continues to be every day worse and worse. It's unprecedentedly bad, which is saying a lot for a 56-year occupation. That's the challenge of this today.
Thank you so much for that incredible answer to really encapsulate the importance of language and reporting. I want to switch a little bit and talk about the international system and these global institutions at play, because you were alluding to it a little bit in your answer. So Michael, the UN has issued many resolutions and many declarations on the occupied Palestinian territories, or the OPT. What are the challenges in implementing these resolutions?
Good question. There are a number of resolutions issued by the United Nations and its various decision-making bodies. The Security Council, which is the most important and influential decision-making body in the international system. The UN General Assembly, which is obviously the parliament of the United Nations, and that every country has a vote there, and there's no veto vote there. And the UN Human Rights Council. All have passed multiple resolutions with respect to this. Let me focus on the Security Council, since that's probably the best example I can give you with respect to the gulf between law, rights, and power. A French legal scholar on the Middle East wrote a book about 20 years ago, which was covering international law, not only in Israel, Palestine, but in a number of other countries as well in the region. And he used a phrase that I wish I had written. He said, in the Middle East, international law is closer to power than it is to justice. And to me, that's the best single encapsulation of what happens. You know, you think these resolutions go to the United Nations to die. They're passed by the UN and yet never enforced. If we're talking about the A word of apartheid, and we're talking about its one of its cousins, which is annexation, then the third A word that we have to talk about when it comes to Israel and Palestine is accountability, or the lack of it. And I'm happy to speak about that a little bit later on. But let me just use the Security Council as an example. As you probably know, there are 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. And since 1973, the United States has been allowed, I think, 35 resolutions, roughly 35 resolutions, have passed the Security Council that have been critical of Israel. But there's been another 32 resolutions critical of Israel with respect to its occupation that the United States has vetoed. And the most recent example came several months ago, I believe in February, after the series of clashes and also then the pogrom at Hawara, where the United Arab Emirates, which is a non-permanent member of the Security Council, wanted to bring a resolution of condemnation at the Security Council. And keep in mind, particularly if you ever hear issues of how biased the United Nations is towards Israel, that there's only been one resolution since 2009, for the last 14 years, that has ever passed the Security Council critical of Israel, which is Resolution 2334, passed in the waning weeks of the Obama administration. So they wanted to bring this resolution. Of the 15 members of the Security Council back in February. 12 of them were prepared to vote for it. 2 of them were on the fence, Albania and the United Kingdom, though I think they would have voted for it had the United States been ready to support that. But the Biden administration stepped in. This in part was also because of the announcement of 9,000 new housing units in the settlements as well as the reestablishment of the 4 settlements in the north of the West Bank that the Israel had removed an agreement with the United States back in 2005. So the resolution really was going to reiterate the demands that were in Resolution 2334 criticizing settlements. The United States opposed it, and that was sufficient to be able to block the resolution, even though we've read lots of stories recently about the deterioration of the personal relationship between Netanyahu on the one hand and Biden on the other. The United States was still prepared to act as a diplomatic shield for Israel with regards to. So what happened instead was that there was a presidential statement which has no legal effect that was issued that made no mention of Resolution 2334, no mention of the fact that the settlements, as Omar has said, are not only a flagrant violation under international law, but also are a presumptive war crime under the Rome Statute. And this is an example, I think, of the way in which the United States has acted as a shield. In his memoirs, which I urge you all to read, Interventions, Kofi Annan wrote in 2012 that the United Nations Security Council is in paralyzed in taking actions and enforcing accountability on Israel, primarily because of the United States. He said the United States would veto even reasonable resolutions with respect to this. And then you read, and again, I urge you to read this as well, his presidential memoirs, when Barack Obama has a very interesting chapter in his memoirs, A Promised Land from 2020. And he said that that Israel put us often in the difficult position where we had to defend them on issues that we ourselves opposed. And when he asked why, he said, he asked himself why, he said, whenever I faced difficulties or challenges as president with any of our natural allies, with Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, I never received any domestic pushback with respect to challenges I had to be tough with them for American interests. There was nothing compared to that with respect to Israel. He said, where any decision made with respect to Israel with an American foreign policy making would wind up generating an immense domestic pushback, which made all of us very tender in how we wound up approaching the issue. He tells this funny story in his memoirs where some of you may know the name of his longtime aide, Ben Rhodes, who was both his speechwriter and his foreign policy advisor. Okay, sorry. Obama said, I had a scheduled meeting with Ben Rhodes. He came in late, he was flustered, and I said, what's going on? He said, well, I just got off the phone with a 50-minute conversation or yelling match with a Democratic congressperson about the Israeli settlements. And Obama said, but I thought he was against the settlements. And Rhodes replied, he said he is, but he's also against us doing anything about the settlements as well, which I think probably epitomizes American foreign policy with respect to this. So if I was to sum up what the UN approach is towards Palestine, I would say it in sort of 2 different answers. One is when the UN is at its very best, it winds up protecting the legitimacy of the Palestinians' right to self-determination. It winds up giving the Palestinians an important international forum to be able to speak. And the UN itself puts a huge amount of resources into Palestine through its various agencies, such as the International Labor Organization, such as OCHA, such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the World Bank, IMF. All of them are well-staffed organizations, or have had well-staffed organizations there. But the UN is often not at its very best. in part because of the paralysis of the Security Council, in part because of the inability of the General Assembly, which passes a wide number of resolutions every December on this issue, to be able to take any action with respect to this, because of the opposition of the United States and the indifference coming from Europe with respect to imposing accountability.
I want to ask you a quick follow-up question to that, because your answer speaks a lot to how the Palestinian community feels both on the land and in the diaspora, and a lot of critics of the UN. Do you think, given all that you said, do you think at this point the UN is really capable or has the capacity to address the occupation as it is right now, as it develops and worsens?
The UN is indispensable with respect to this. I mean, the UN has passed resolutions annually in the General Assembly, which says that the United Nations has a permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine until it is resolved in a satisfactory manner within international legitimacy. And that, to the Palestinians, is indispensable for their ability to be able to assert their rights on the international stage. It's insufficient, but it's indispensable with respect to that. And until, I suppose, either civil society within the United States is able to begin to change American political decision-making in Washington, I'm afraid we're going to see the same typical paralysis where parts of the Democratic Party are defending things they must know in their hearts are wrong and are contrary to American values.
Thank you. Now I'll have one more question for us before we open into the Q&A. For those on Zoom, feel free to ask your question in the chat and we'll read it to you. So this question will be for either of you or for both of you. With this continuation of land grabbing, the settlement expansion, and especially considering the outward policies of this new far-right government in Israel that was voted into power last December, many people are realizing that the two-state solution is no longer viable. With that being said, supporters and some individuals worry that the idea of not having a two-state solution is problematic and worrisome. Can you give your thoughts on the viability of a two-state solution, and if you think it's no longer viable, what you envision for a solution?
I can start. So, yeah, I'll start. I'll probably give it to Chris Lynk pretty soon. Look, I'm gonna acknowledge I'm gonna give a non-answer because but I will try and answer your question in a non-answer type of way. I think our conversation in the US generally is so driven by solutions that we forget the problem that necessitates a solution, right? It's almost as if you ask most mainstream discourse, what's the problem in Israel-Palestine? But well, the lack of a two-state solution. That's not the problem, right? The problem is continued expropriation of Palestinian land, continuing movement restrictions, demolitions of Palestinian homes, collective punishment, structural violence, repression, on and on and on. But most people don't realize that because it becomes one of these circular kind of logics, right? So, at the end of the day, whatever we might want for a future solution, today we have a one-state reality. Apartheid, right? And that's not even just human rights discourse. Many of you probably, may be familiar. Foreign Affairs, maybe their lead article in May and June is a piece by 4 prominent American political scientists detailed the one-state reality, right? And as I started with my initial question, right? I mean, you have one government that in effect rules over the entire area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. What do I mean by that? Yeah, you talked, Omar, you talked about Palestinian Authority, you talked about, Hamas is in Gaza. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, 90%, about 90% of the land is under the exclusive control of the Israeli government. That is 70% of the land, which is Israel within the Green Line. And that is the majority of the West Bank, Area C, and completely East Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank. Israel has exclusive authority. The Palestinian Authority can't, literally, if the Palestinian Authority in East Jerusalem, an official shows up there or tries to have a cultural event or etc., they have been arrested for doing so. So in the remaining 10%, right, which is the 25% Gaza Strip, in these small enclaves, like territorial islands, some would use the term Bantustans, and the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, yes, they manage affairs, right? They pick up the trash, they fix the potholes, they provide some education. But they have no, even in these areas, they have no control over the airspace, they have no control over movement, they have no control over the collection of taxes, they have no control over the issuance of ID cards. The Israeli government does that. They have no control over access to natural resources. They have no control over most of the basic aspects of everyday life. This is not a path for the Palestinian Authority or the Lynk. Let me be clear. We've documented serious crimes. These are thuggish authorities, frankly. PA officials need a permit to go, in some cases, 1 kilometer beyond their house, but yet they run a police state that picks up Palestinians in coordination, by the way, with the Israeli government. So a lot of what the PA does is subcontract, in effect, for the Israeli occupation. But my point is to say we have one government that rules over this area. Now, what the solution might be in the future could take many different forms, right? But we're so far away from thinking about a solution. Our call to Human Rights Watch is let's end the structural, let's dismantle apartheid, let's end the structural violations, let's create a reality where there is not the structural repression, and then a solution can be figured out that's in the best interest, built on the human rights of Israelis and Palestinians for the future. But so long as we continue to focus on solutions, we are in effect saying that so long as there's no political solution, Palestinians will continue to be born in Gaza without the right to free movement. Palestinians will continue to be born in the West Bank without basic civil rights, without the right to free expression, assembly, and association. By the way, like their fathers, like their grandmothers before them, generations, Palestinians will continue to be born in Israel proper, with an inferior legal status by law. Palestinian refugees will continue to be born in refugee camps, like their mothers and grandfathers before them. The point here is we need to focus on ending the structural violence, and we can find a political solution in the future. So I believe part of the shift in discourse is to say, whatever the number of solutions might be, there is no solution so long as the fundamental rights Palestinians and Israelis isn't respected. There is no solution so long as Gaza remains an open air prison, so long as Palestinians continue to live under apartheid. All those things must end. Let's focus on ending those, and let's not let the political powers that be make us think that the problem is some complicated, what is the solution? Like, it's so complicated, There are many possible solutions, but we need to get there, and to get there we need to spend apartheid.
I would have given you the same kind of non-answer a year ago. I'm no longer special rapporteur, so let me see if I can answer this question. I don't think there's any solution for the future of the equal number of Israelis, Jews, and Palestinian Arabs who live between the river and the sea, except one that is built on the cornerstones of equality, democracy, and human rights. It's got to be a rights-based approach to this. I can think of 5 potential solutions that are probably prominent we should at least pay attention to. One would be a 2-state solution, which has got the international political consensus currently. The second would be a one-state democratic solution built on these cornerstones. A third would be a one-state apartheid, formal apartheid solution where Israel actually annexes the rest of the territories, probably de jure, and then rules over 5+ million non-citizens. A fourth would be what I call the 1.5-state solution, which is basically what the Trump plan was about, was a very small Palestinian Bantustan that could issue its own stamps, fly its own flag, have its own seat at the United Nations, but would be a brand new addition to the vocabulary of political science as to what a state would be. And the fifth really is a continuation of the status quo right now, with Israel realizing it can't make it would be folly to try to make a formal declaration of annexation. So it just continues de facto on the ground, but it hopes one day will be de jure on the ground. Those are the 5 approaches that I see as probable solutions. So the question really is 2-state solution, as the international community over and over says, or a 1-state democratic solution. Let me just briefly talk about a 2-state solution. I think the day of a two-state solution is long gone. I certainly was one of those 30 years ago when I saw the famous handshake between Rabin and Arafat on the law. I thought this will be process. We were living the time when the Cold War was ending and the Berlin Wall had fallen, when apartheid had collapsed, and Mandela was on the way to winning his first election in a free South Africa. It seemed to be a spirit of the times. Well, maybe Meatloaf would say 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but with respect to Palestine, it has only gotten worse. And we can see now that the Oslo process, instead of creating and enabling a Palestine state in the making, has enabled, in fact, the deepening of the occupation. So I no longer believe that there's a two-state solution around. And I find it vacuous when the international community, be it at the United Nations or be it particularly any of the diplomatic offices in the global north, repeat, we want to see the parties go back to a negotiating table and we want to see a two-state solution. Really what that means is that you have two highly unequal parties based on realpolitik rather than on a rights-based approach. We're going to negotiate over what a state is about. You know, the very famous quip that I first heard 20 years ago is two people in at a kitchen negotiating over who's going to eat the pizza, and while they're negotiating over who gets which parts of the pizza, one party is eating the pizza. The international community, and again the global north, they, I realize, don't even have a plan A anymore. After the expiry 9 years ago of the Kerry peace process, there's been nothing serious done since then. And if you ever did bring the Palestinians and the Israelis back to the table without a rights-based approach, without international law guiding them, what you're asking for is a chess game where one side has all the chess pieces and the other side gets to play with a handful of pawns in terms of determining the future. Far better, so far better in my mind that we think of a one-state democratic solution centered on human rights and equality. The Palestinians already, according to some demographers, already have a slight majority of the population between the river and the sea. That difference is only probably going to continue to grow in the years to come. The possibility of being able to build a common future with shared prosperity based on a constitutional arrangement that which the parties themselves would have to decide. But that was what was done in South Africa 30 years ago, is that they worked out a process where the rights of the white minority wind up being protected. In fact, probably protected too much. I made my very first trip to South Africa in November of last year. And yes, political apartheid ended 30 years ago. Political apartheid ended 30 years ago. Economic apartheid, I'm afraid to say, is alive and well in there. So it would wind up making sure we learned the proper lessons, the positive lessons from transition to democracy in South Africa, but also remember the negative lessons of what the last 30 years has meant there as well. But I believe that these two peoples who both love the land so well, both of them suffering from enormous trauma, European Jews in Israel, obviously with the shadow of the Holocaust, Palestinian Arabs with the shadow of the Nakba and the 75 years of dispossession since. Both of them, in words of a book I'm reading right now called The Haifa Republic by an Israeli philosopher, talks about the importance of remembering to forget. And that's not saying you're forgetting what's happened, but you learn to place the trauma and the historical experiences you've had in a proper box, and then learn to be able to move forward. I mean, I live in a country that has a multiple of peoples. It has obviously Anglophones, it has Francophones, and it has indigenous peoples, among others there. And we're still learning our ways of trying to live with each other within a constitutional framework. But it has worked imperfectly. Whatever just peace comes to Israel and Palestine is going to be imperfect. But I think the least imperfect peace that would be a one-state solution with one person, one vote on a constitutional arrangement that recognizes the rights of both peoples in terms of their religions, in terms of their language, and most importantly, in terms of their ability to live together.
Thank you both so much for your answers. Now we're going to open it up for the Q&A. I'm going to have Obey here run the microphone for anyone, and then we'll also go with Zoom questions.
Hi there, thank you both. My name is Aitan. I have two questions, one for each of you. The first for Professor Lynk. So you mentioned some of the labor issues, and I understand it's a specialty of yours. Can you talk a bit about the labor rights situation for the Palestinian workers for the Israeli companies in the settlements, and how the laws do or don't apply there? And then my other question for Omar. Can you talk a bit about your experience within the Israeli court system? Because I think a lot of times we know and understand the draconian military courts that exist, but I think there's the other courts that you went through for court objectivity. I know Shakir and others are kind of making their way through that court. So can you talk a bit about how those do or don't work?
Thank you. Those are both important questions. And I'm going to try to be brief in answering the questions. I think there's probably going to be a lot, but I really like your questions. As a labor lawyer, yes. Look, there's roughly around 90,000 Palestinians who cross every day into Israel to be able to work in Israeli factories, in Israeli farms, Israeli restaurants, Israeli construction. They themselves have very few labor protections of the type that would be enjoyed by Jewish labor members who belong to the history group. I believe the figure is around 35,000 Palestinians work in Israeli settlements, sometimes doing would be municipal work that Jewish Israelis don't want to do. Often it's there as construction workers who are building more housing units in the Israeli settlements. They have no union protection. Part of their wages would be what wages they do get would be deducted by Israel and meant to be turned back into the Palestinian Authority, so they don't see the full benefit of what wages they do wind up having. If they're fired, they're fired. They have no union to be able to go to, be able to grieve. There's no occupational health and safety legislation that really effectively winds up covering them. And a lot of them, the Palestinians, let's remember, are among the most educated Arabs in the Arab world. And I remember somebody saying to me when I was in Amman on one of my trips to special rapporteurs, she said, no Palestinian parent brings up their children, sends them to university with the dream of becoming a laborer in the settlements or in Israel. But yet that winds up dominating a significant part of the Palestinian economy, because there's in a shattered economic space that is the West Bank. There is really no ability to be able to move not only people, but also the ability to be able to move goods as well. So the jobs are few. The World Bank issues twice yearly reports on the status of the Palestinian economy. It shows that unemployment rates are around 18 to 25% in the West Bank. They're over 50% in Gaza, and they say the unemployment rate in Gaza is the highest unemployment rate of any economic unit that they examine anywhere in the world. So working conditions are bad when you're working generally in Palestinian factories, and they're just as bad with respect to working in Israeli settlements or working across the Green Line in the Israeli economy.
Yeah, just echoing it, it's a great question. So without getting sort of into too much of the minutia, so for those that came late to the event, I mentioned earlier how I was deported by the Israeli government in late 2019. So the way it played out, I'm just going to focus on the last chapter of this because there were several earlier incarnations. So in May of 2018, I get an order by the Israeli government saying, we've determined that you are a supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Israeli law, a law passed in 2017, instructs the Interior Ministry to deny entry to supporters of BDS. And so I was given 14 days to leave the country. So we immediately went to the Jerusalem District Court and we filed a challenge. We first of all challenged the legality of the law itself. What kind of country that claims to be democratic, that has a basic law will have a political litmus test on entry, right? Basically, like, do you support, this very much respected international position or not? But then we also challenge the way it was applied to us, as I noted earlier. Like Human Rights Watch takes no positions on boycotts of any country, right? We support the right to boycott, and we document abuses by all actors, including companies, and we call on companies to not abuse rights. And so we tell companies, as we found in Israel Palestine through decades of research, if you work in settlements, you're invariably benefiting from and contributing to serious rights abuse, and you must end your activities. So we found that challenge in the court. The district court gave me an injunction, so I was allowed to stay when we fought the case. We had a couple of hearings in the district court. Very surreal experience. I'm sitting in a courtroom in Hebrew, and the discussions about my social media posts, about what is in my Twitter bio, about Human Rights Watch's reporting, etc. And the court upheld the government's decision. And I'll get to the reasoning in a second. So we appealed to the High Court of Justice. We get a hearing in the High Court of Justice. Of course, one of the three justices that I had was a settler himself. So this is somebody living in territory expropriated from Palestinians, which is a war crime under international law. He's driving to the courtroom to hear my case from a settlement. But that's not even the issue, right? I mean, forget even that. I mean, the High Court is, so they upheld 3-0 my deportation. And the government's logic, first of all, they didn't even consider the challenge to whether the law is even legally valid. They basically said, we're going to punt on that question. This has been upheld by the court before. They basically said, okay, you say that human rights advocacy is not the same as boycott. Let's be clear. The law applies to human rights-based advocacy. So basically, human rights-based advocacy. Yeah, we do this around the world. We'll say to a company in Bangladesh, don't use child labor, don't do sweatshops. To the Israeli High Court, that's grounds when it's only when it's applied to Palestinians. By the way, you've probably seen that the Israeli protesting. Many people are calling to boycott, in regards to the judicial protest. But when it's about Palestinian rights, that's a ground to be deported. And it doesn't matter that it's settlements. We actually, haven't made a similar call about activities in Israel proper. It's only about working in settlements, right? But even that, which is a consensus basic human rights proposition, is ground. So it's upheld 3-0. I was given 20 days to leave the country. I left the country on day 20. Let me just note parenthetically, this is not some anomaly in my case, right? The High Court has signed off on settlements. They've signed off on, punitive demolitions of Palestinian homes. They've signed off on use of force standards that allow killing Palestinians in cases where there's no imminent threat to the life of Israeli soldiers, which is the basic human rights standards. They have put their finger, they have rubber stamped the repression and the abuses on virtually every issue, including that, punitive withholding of bodies of Palestinians after they've been killed by Israeli forces. So many other issues bears the impetus of the Israeli High Court.
We'll do one more question first, and then we'll look for Zoom.
Hi, my name is Gael. I have a question that's maybe on the broader spectrum. For some countries, such as Egypt and Bahrain, and most recently the UAE, have signed peace treaties with Israel and have considered Israel as a state. Whereas another group of countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq still refuse to consider Israel as its own state. How do you think this has impacted human rights violations in Palestine? And do you think countries should lean more towards recognizing Israel as a state? Would that kind of make things easier for Palestinians? Thank you.
I'll answer, but if you want to go first.
Okay. I'll just start quickly and give it to Professor Lynk. So most Arab countries, I would say, despite what their rhetorical positions are, many Arab countries have long quietly engaged the Israeli government and certainly have not prioritized. Most countries in the Arab world don't care about the human rights of their own people, much less the human rights of Palestinians. And many of the states that have normalized relations with Israel have, have very bad human rights record, committed war crimes, crimes against humanity. These agreements are nothing more than, glorified attempts, by repressive regimes and governments to improve, to further their own interests, to improve business transactions, to improve their standing in the international community, to let go of pressure. So at the very same time, so in general, these governments haven't really done much for Palestinians, even the ones you mentioned that had rhetorically, issued condemnation. In practice, they've done very, very little to improve that said, the normalization agreements have, whatever minor motivation might have existed for the Israeli government to ever relent in its apartheid to Palestinians, part of that has gone away. They've been able to say, look, we have, we've gotten peace without making movement on the Palestinians. So if you're an Israeli voter going to vote in elections and your government for decades, commits these abuses with impunity, why would you ever vote for anything differently? So I think they've been damaging in the sense of creating even more reason or even less reason for the Israeli government to relent on the status quo. Our report's very clear on what the obligations are on states. They need to ensure, one, to support efforts to hold perpetrators to account, and secondly, they must end all forms of complicity with Israel's crimes against humanity, apartheid, persecution. That means vetting bilateral agreements to ensure, non-complicity in the crime, ending agreements where it makes you complicit. That means stopping arms sales and military support so long as apartheid continues. It means many, many steps that ensure that you're not aiding and abetting crimes against humanity.
I'll just echo that. I mean, the standard, long-standing, I suppose, political assumption in the Arab world was the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which I think was headed by Saudi Arabia, which basically said to Israel, if you allow a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, we will open up or resume relations with you. And that had been the long-standing standard outside of Jordan and Egypt until the Abraham Accords were accomplished in 2020. And remember the context. The United States had issued in January of 2020 the Trump peace plan, which gave the green light for Israel to annex over 40% of the West Bank, including every single existing Israeli settlement, and then allow a Palestinian state, a state-lit, to emerge out of the ashes of that. There was so much international opposition to that. Pope Francis, Pope Francis saying that he was opposed to inequitable peace proposals. The European Union stated its opposition to the Trump peace plan. Even by June of 2020, the United States realized itself that it was going nowhere with this, and as a substitute for allowing Israel to go ahead with the formal annexation of parts of the West Bank, it engineered the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords have not been undone by Biden. Even the most egregious part of the Abraham Accords was the recognition by the United States of the annexation by Morocco of the bulk of Western Sahara. So here you have, if you like, a peace agreement between Israel and Morocco, where one disreputable occupier is scratching the back of another disreputable occupier as well. So, but I agree with Omar. These have set back the ability of the Palestinians to win legitimacy. On the one hand, these countries all continue to vote for the Palestinian resolutions that go through the United Nations. They may want peace, and they may have a peace arrangement with Israel, but they know that the Moroccan people or the citizens in the United Arab Emirates are very much in favor of the Palestinians. So they have to maintain a rapport, and best done through votes of the United Nations. To say we're still in support of Palestine, even as, particularly with the UAE, there are billions and billions of dollars of trade now emerging, particularly with respect to weaponry that's going from Israel to the UAE. So yes, it is a setback. It's going to make the ability of a just peace, I think, occur so much later into the future, and I hope it doesn't spread.
So we'll take one question from Zoom here. Second. This question comes from Jonathan Robert. Can each comment on the value, if any, of the ICC's ongoing investigation that covers the since 2014?
Sure. The in 2004 and 2015, the Palestine was accepted as a member state of the Assembly of States with respect to the Rome Statute of 1998, which created the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is based in The Hague, and it focuses on crimes against humanity, war crimes, the crime of aggression, and genocide. Palestine, in joining, backdated their application to June of 2014, which was just before the start of the summer 2014 assault by Israel on Gaza. So it took, and then there was diplomatic wrangles and judicial wrangles at the International Criminal Court as to whether or not the Palestine's ascension was proper and whether or not the ICC had jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territory. There were rulings by a group of 3 judges in February of 2021, which said that yes, majority said yes, there is jurisdiction, and that completes, if you like, the first preliminary investigative stage of the process. The second formal investigation stage then began in March of 2021, so 2 years ago. And since then, there's been a change in the chief prosecutor. It's now a British lawyer, Karim Khan. And I know the main issues in front of the International Criminal Court with respect to the complaints against Israel is, number one, were there war crimes committed by Israel and by Hamas or other armed groups in Gaza during the June 2014 war, and then the subsequent assaults on Gaza in 2018 and 2021, I believe, have been added to that complaint. The second major issue are the settlements of war crime under the Rome Statute, and in many ways that is a very straightforward question. The language is very clear, forbidding an occupying power from placing its own civilians into an occupied territory in exceptionally clear and broad language. The problem right now is that number one, there are limited resources at the court. Number two, the chief prosecutor has put a number of his limited resources into investigating Russian war crimes, or probably Russian and Ukrainian war crimes during the conduct of the war there over the last 13 months. That has meant, certainly to the frustration of those Palestinian and Israeli groups that would wind up supporting the formal investigation at the ICC, as to the very slow pace of the investigation. So that's the best that I know of things are right now. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think you summarized. I would just add that, like, the reason why the ICC investigation is critical is precisely because, and Professor Lynk alluded to this earlier, there has been a wall of impunity that victims of serious abuses have faced for decades. The Israeli investigative process is a whitewash mechanism, as the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem has described. There is no forum for Palestinian victims of serious abuses to go to get redress anywhere in the world. So the ICC was created exactly for these sorts of issues. And in many ways, what Professor Lynk alluded to, it's a test of the will of the international system. Will the ICC truly be, there are some legal questions the court has to deal with that are tricky and novel, including, we've called them apartheid and persecution, which is under the Rome Statute. So under the jurisdiction of the court to be taken up. We've also called on all the other issues. There's, some of these cases don't have much precedent, some of the legal theories there. So there are legal questions. I don't want to diminish them, but the real test is, for a while it was, will states allow the prosecutor to really have prosecutorial independence? And there were threats, but Bensouda, the former prosecutor, stuck it through and made a, call for the open the formal probe subject to this jurisdictional decision. Now it's a challenge for the prosecutor there is political pressure out there, but really to be able to make a decision on the merits. And it's difficult for anybody to look at these facts and not reach a conclusion that there needs to be criminal charges brought against serious Israeli officials.
I just want to add one thought to that, which emerges from what you said, Omar. The United States, the global North, all call for peaceful negotiations with respect to the Palestinians. There's no government in Israel that wants that. So where are the Palestinians to go if they're going to try to, try to even off these on equal scales? So when the Palestinians turned to the ICC, many countries in the global north, including my country, oppose that, and certainly the United States opposes that as well. When the Palestinians turned to the International Court of Justice, which is also in The Hague, but with a different type of jurisdiction, many countries in the global north say, don't go there, you're trying to politicize issues in front of a court when you should be negotiating with a government that doesn't want to negotiate with you with regards to that. So there are, I think, very unsophisticated arguments coming from the United States, coming from Canada, coming from some countries in Europe, which try to make sure that the door remains closed for every legitimate forum that the Palestinians can appeal to with respect to the exercise and the fulfillment of their rights. The ICC is one example by the opposition. The ICJ, which will be hearing an advisory opinion request probably early next year in The Hague, is another example of where they winds up facing strong opposition from countries that say they believe rhetorically in the rules-based order and international law.
Sorry, maybe a 30-second addition, which is just to add to Professor Link's great point. When Palestinians, although turn to violence, it's immediately called terrorism. When they turn to boycotts, that's called economic terrorism. It's called anti-Semitic. When they go protest on the street, it's called other forms of violence. When they go to international bodies, it's called diplomatic terrorism. When they do human rights work, it's called terrorism. I mean, they're basically telling Palestinians your only choice is submission, surrender. Anything else you do is terrorism. I mean, it just goes to show you they're leaving no legitimate means for Palestinians to challenge. Everything is inappropriate except accepting your own submission.
Thank you both for that. The next question from Zoom comes from Diane Fall. Please comment on the plight of the Bedouin and so-called unrecognized villages slated for destruction, the destruction of their culture, and the settlement of Ukrainian Jewish refugees into the Negev or Negev region. Do you see this as speeding up displacement or land grabs of Bedouin land?
So let me give you a little context. Thank you for the question. Clearly we have some folks that are really in tune to the details. So the Negev is a large region and inside Green Line Israel in the south. There are about 35, give or take, because there was a process, but about 35 villages, communities of Palestinian Bedouins that have not been recognized by the Israeli government, right? What does that mean? That means these are communities that do not receive services from the Israeli government, not connected to the electricity grids, not connected to the water grids. They're illegal by virtue of living and breathing in their homes. They face regular demolitions. There's some villages like one called Apartheid that's been demolished over 200 times. These are communities inside Israel proper, right? That literally, their very living in this community poses, is illegal. And these practices continue for many years. The Israeli government has a policy, it's a formal policy to Judaize the Negev, that is to move Jewish communities to these areas. In some cases, there have been villages named with the very same Arabic name. They've kicked out Hayran, where they've kicked out the Palestinian Bedouin community to build a Jewish town over their homes. And this has been a long-standing practice. This is inside Green Line Israel, right? So, the Zoom question alludes to Ukrainians moving in. Certainly, that's part of it. But the larger trend is this plan to Judaize, and that's part of when Professor Lynk talked about the intent. It's part of the intent to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians, which is one of the three elements that underscores Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. And I think the displacement of the Bedouins, Palestinian Bedouins, highlights the severe discrimination and repression that even inside Green Line Israel, Palestinians face. It's part of the same underlying structure that underlies Israel's apartheid. And so it's critical. And right now, by the way, the new minister in the new Israeli government in charge of Negev comes from Ben-Gvir's party. Itamar Ben-Gvir, some of you who follow the news might know, is Israel's new national security minister. He's an individual who has been convicted by Israeli courts, the same courts a question or two ago I talked about rubber stamp apartheid. They have found that he has committed incitement to violence and support for terrorist organizations. And his party runs the Negev. So there's a clear policy and plan there that's intended to further the project, which underlies really government policy from the river to the sea, which is basically maximum land, minimum Palestinians. That maxim applies certainly to Negev.
We can take one more question from the audience.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. I am currently an undergrad student at USD, so I'm going to be a journalist. And I do very much agree with your statement that the global has a tendency to keep our coverage just or tendency to just not talk about what's happening. It's more that I'd rather really talk about it. I noticed that because you're catering to a Palestinian audience, then they kind of become a part of the story of trying to appeal to them when that necessarily shouldn't be the case because it is such a Palestinian issue. I don't think future journalists should navigate that. Hopefully that question makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe can I keep the mic for a second? So is your question about how do they navigate the dynamics of basically speaking in Palestinian voice? Was that your question?
I guess the question is how do we get Palestinians to carry on ensuring that the reason why it is, related to, like directly related to Palestinians, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'll start, so you might have more to say, and I say this humbly as a non-journalist, so, but what I will say is that, I think if you were, like, there's so often a tendency to do two things. One is not to to interview and give voice to Palestinians. So making an effort when Palestinians are killed, they're so often reduced to numbers. So often the Israeli government narrative is just accepted hook, line and sinker, right? There's no sort of critical challenging of that information. There's not an effort to go to the communities. And part of this is intentionally done by the government, and you can really tell a journalist in Israel, Palestine by where they live, who they interact with, what kind of stories. It's much easier when something happens. The Israeli government within an hour will have a press release for a journalist. They'll have their own explanation in good English. They'll have people available to you. If you diverge from the official narrative, your editor will get calls. You'll be pressured. You'll be smeared. You might get your visa blocked. So they make it a lot harder to do the work. So I think if you're going to end up being a field reporter in Israel, Palestine, part of your challenge is to, be brave enough and bold enough to challenge the official narrative. You should do this with every government, by the way, not unique to Israel. Like, I covered Egypt, I covered many places in the world, and the US, by the way, I worked on Guantanamo. I know a thing or two about lying and misdirecting by government officials, but you have to always question and challenge the official narrative. You have to go and interview people, affected communities. It makes all the difference in the world, right? I mean, when you actually listen to stories, again, you don't take everything at face value. It's not that people misrepresent, but you have to corroborate. There's really amazing work being done now. It's a new wave of journalism, the digital investigations. That's a whole new area, and I've seen great reporting, even by the Washington Post and the New York Times, that go to areas where the Israeli army raids are, and they use technology to break it down. So, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but interview affected communities, challenge, official narratives, make sure that part of your job when you're a field reporter. By the way, most reporters on the ground get it. Their problem is not that; it's probably the editor, sitting. Because how can they teach their editor a story? Because their editor is going to want something new and different, right? So part of your challenge as a journalist is to work and engage your structure and your institution, your editor, your others. Bring them to the field. Let them see the reality. Find a way to get them to understand the value of doing the critical, important work and build their backbone. So when you do an important story, they're going to have your back in doing it.
One of the big challenges always is avoiding the concept of both sides of it.
Yes.
And for a long time, Palestinians were happy with both sides of it. At least they finally got heard, even though it gave an incomplete and very accurate version of the underlying truth that was going on. But I see, certainly in some of the reporting from New York Times and the Washington Post, among others, I say that as well with respect to the Guardian, that there's a move away from that. There's been a tendency usually to treat Israel and Palestine as a football game, as a football match with two evenly placed teams. on the field, and you're simply reporting about who moved the ball down the field and who moved the ball back in how you want to report in Israel and Palestine. I'm old enough in this room, and maybe there's a few others in this room, that I could see the shift in the 1980s with respect to the reporting on South Africa. That for the longest time, either there was nothing being reported in North American press on South Africa, or it was either talking about the violent natives, or it was then graduated to a form of both sides of them. And it only was really with 1985, 1986 that you begin to see probably better journalists who were more intently interested in wanting to determine what was going on with respect to this. And in South Africa, I remember beginning to watch the change from the use of the term cycle of violence into structure of violence. We haven't got there yet. We're still using, and I still see quite frequently, the term cycle of violence. You know, and I saw it repeated lots of times over the last 2 or 3 months in Israel and Palestine. It's not cycle of violence in South Africa. It's not cycle of violence in Palestine. It's a structure of violence that winds up generating a reaction. But virtually every day the Palestinians live, they're under some form of structure of violence in terms of where they can go, where they can wind up working, who they can wind up marrying, and how long they have to stand humiliation for. Before I came over here tonight, I read this afternoon an excellent article and I recommend it to anybody, in Jewish Currents. It was an interview with Amira Haas, and she's been a long time Israeli Jewish journalist covering the occupation. She lived for 4 years in the 90s in Gaza and has lived ever since 1997 in Ramallah. Her reporting is impeccable. Indeed, a couple of years ago, I read the memoir of one of the former directors of the Shin Bet, Amy Allion, who actually also says that it's apartheid in the occupied territories. And he used to say that her reporting was so good that he trusted it as to what was going on in the occupied territories more than the intelligence that he was getting from his own Shin Bet operatives with respect to that. So my instinct in the end of the day is, it echoes what Omar said, you know, is that old phrase, telling truth to power with respect to this. You have to understand the situation that's going on, understand where particularly where the power lies, who has the power and who doesn't have the power, and report on that.
I just had one thing. This is human rights training that I had, but I think it's applicable to journalists, right? My former clinical advisor when I had law school used to tell me, "You're as strong as your weakest fact," as a human rights documenter, and I've kept that with me
I'm
throughout.
glad you didn't say weakest link. I hate that term.
Well, we know you're not the weakest link. Sorry, I'm trying to resist the joke. But in all seriousness, hard to record that joke. But in all seriousness, as a journalist, make sure you get it right. You make one mistake being critical, and you're in trouble. And that's up with me too.
My last thought is actually the advice I got when I became Special Rapporteur. It applied to me, it applies to the work of I think of human rights advocates, but it also would apply, I think, to journalists as well. I was bitterly attacked, particularly by my own foreign minister when I was appointed as Special Rapporteur. And I was feeling, gee, I don't think I want to do this. And I had my two predecessors, John Dugard and Richard Falk, come to my defense. And one of them, I think it was Richard, gave me advice in those early days, which I've followed ever since, which I give to you. It was his gift to me. I'm passing it on to you. He said, there are two things you need to be a good Special Rapporteur, two things you need to be a good journalist. One is you've got to be fearless. You've got to be able to track down those facts. You've got to be able to say where the facts wind up leading you. You've got to give that analysis as well. And you've got to say, no matter who dislikes reporting that you're doing. The second thing is you've got to be responsible. You've got to make sure that what you're saying is grounded in verifiable facts, or in law, or in analysis. And if you maintain those two things in mind, being fearless and being responsible, you can't go wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you both for your answers. Now to close out, I kind of want to speak to our unique responsibility as US citizens and leave us with, a strategic plan of action and, an understanding of what we can do to help, Palestinians, help end the occupation, help them, gain freedom. I did some research this morning. I want to ask the audience here, you can shout out the answer. Can you take a guess how much the city of San Diego gives to Israel for military funding per year? Now, for context, the US as a country gives $3.8 billion a year in official funding, not including private donations and other means of funding. So can anyone just shout out a guess of how much the city of San Diego gives?
36 million?
It was a little too high, but it was $18.6 million a year, and that's right here in San Diego.
Oh, the city.
Why?
I did the.
Yeah, that's the question,
For what?
Yeah, oh, that goes directly to military funding weapons of Israel. So, with such a high number, we talked about, these global institutions, we talked about systematic violence. Sometimes we feel powerless, as individuals especially, going against this and advocating and fighting for justice. So can you guys speak a little bit to what we can do as individuals, as an institution, to help, make sure that human rights are respected?
You go first, because you're the American, I'm not.
I actually want to give this question to Eric, actually, because he's probably better able to answer this than me. Look, what I would say is, you guys are here on a Friday in beautiful weather in San Diego, so you've already taken a big step, to sort of expose yourself to the facts, right? So, I think, look, the first part of any answer is, do what you do as a concerned citizen, write to your representatives, post on social media, talk to your friends, invite them to the next event, organize in your community. But that's not really what I want to tell you, because those things, you didn't need me to answer the question. What I would say, right, is that what Eric just did, right, is what you all need to do, which is find your direct connection to these issues. As an American, it's not some abstraction. This isn't something happening halfway across the world. The tax deadline just passed. You guys pay taxes, those dollars, part of them are going to supporting these activities, but it's not just your tax dollars, your citizen dollars. It might be your church, your synagogue, your mosque. It might be your labor union. It might be your student, funding. It might be that you pay, if you're a student at this university, it might well be, right, that like that's going, it's part of a university that's investing its endowment in companies that are profiting off of apartheid and occupation. So I think the best thing you can do is to localize this issue, right? Don't make it seem like you're some disconnected person calling for other people to take action. Try and force that action to take place where you're directly connected. I don't want my church, I don't want my synagogue, I don't want my university, I don't want my labor union to be invested in these activities. I don't want my university to be, opening a campus in this area, or I don't want this program of mine to be doing this joint research. There are direct connections. That's part of what makes, again, I work in many countries around the world, right? But, some people say, part of, why is there some activist, what they would say is disproportionate focus on Israel. I reject the premise, right? Because many of us have worked on many issues. Human rights watch in 100 countries. I've worked on all these other issues. If there's an answer to that question, it's because our institutions and companies and government has a disproportionate focus on Israel, right? We don't see the same level of American corporations and government funding human rights abuses in, take whatever context, by the Syrian government or elsewhere. There are some other examples, right? Where Saudi Arabia maybe, where there is some level of involvement. When it comes to Israel, it's just unquestioned. Look at any of the big tech companies. Don't just look at, and look at the nature of their agreements with the Israeli government. You'll see a much more involved answer. So I think, I do think Eric should conclude with what you can do here in this community, but that would be generally what I would answer.
I just have two short things to add to that. One is coming from a Canadian, saying to you, you have a special responsibility simply because the outsized role that the United States winds up playing in shielding Israel and perpetuating a unjust and permanent occupation. But to go with that, it's going to be the voices, the collective voices of hundreds of thousands and ideally millions of Americans. And you see that in the polling, that there's increasingly stronger support for Palestinians and weaker support for Israelis, particularly among democratic-leaning Americans. That we're now in a moment where the possibility of doing good civil society work to change not only public opinion, but also change political opinion well is there. And I'll leave you with this last note. All of you, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that very famous quote attributed to Martin Luther King, that the arc of history bends towards justice, but it bends slowly. Bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. But what is not often remembered is what his lieutenant, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, said. He said, yes, the arc of history bends towards justice, but you got to make it bend. You've got to be able to pull it yourself to be able to do that. So all of us, you here and myself in Canada, have that kind of responsibility of making sure that arc of history bends and that we're pulling it to bend.
That's a beautiful note, and I need to add something, but I also want to leave you the note of optimism, which is that there, as much as we're facing unprecedented repression on the ground, there's this moment of clear-eyed assessments across Israeli, Palestinian, global civil society. You're on the right side of history. One day, I'm confident. I wouldn't get up in the morning to do this job if I didn't believe one day we're going to dismantle apartheid. So no, as hard as it is, and as much risk as they are, things can and will change and are changing, at least in the discussion that will transit on the ground. So I think take that call, but just know that things that you can be a part of changing that, and that's something you can look back on proudly in the future.
Now to wrap up, I do want to speak to what we can do here, very local, at USD and being a part of this institution. And that $13.6 million a year that San Diego gives, just to give an idea of what that could fund alternatively, that's 2,215 public housing households a year. That's 6,484 children receiving free or low-cost health care, or that's 203 elementary school teachers as well. So, we really have to care, and we really have to care about our investments, where they're going. We really have to care about justice. Everyone wants peace and everyone wants justice. But the question is, what are you willing to do such to get there? And here at USD, we aren't innocent, unfortunately. And my student org has launched this petitioning for USD to have more consistency with their mission statement. Their mission statement talks about values of social justice, values of ethical conduct, values of ethical inquiry and research, but they also have some relationships with the state of Israel, such as a program that takes students to Jerusalem to study the water infrastructure and study the development of water technology for water engineering. It learns about desalination and wastewater treatment, but all of this technology, all these advancements, all this water that they're dealing with wouldn't be possible without this historic dispossession, colonization, and stealing of Palestinian land that has been happening for 75 years. So, I ask you on Zoom and in the audience to really question, if you do care, what does that care look like? If you do want justice, what does that look like? And sometimes it's as easy as filling out a petition. So if you're in this room and you're affiliated with USD in any way, whether you're a student, a professor, a staff member, a parent, alumni, if you're on Zoom and you're any of those as well, please take 5-10 minutes and look at the petition. There are some resources there. There's a few videos. They're very short. Everything's fact-checked. And it really lays out the kind of complicity and the inconsistencies that program that we have here at USD has with these human rights abuses. So I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes. I'm also going to send a link on the Zoom chat. But please join me in thanking our two amazing speakers. And as we wrap up, I just want to remind you that Michael Lynk's books are here available to buy as well, and I'm sure he's willing to give a signature, maybe with a little tip with it. But thank you all for coming. It's really important, and it means a lot to all of us. And I think it speaks with 3 non-Palestinians on this floor here, just how important it is our role, regardless of identity that we play. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good night.